Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Please come next Tuesday for an in-person only event with Carl Little as he presents his newly published book, The Art of Penobscot Bay. He will give a slideshow and we'll have copies for sale and for signing. Before introducing Tatia, I'd like to review just a few housekeeping items. We will be recording this event, and for our online audience, if you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them to the chat feature. Kate Pickup will direct them to Tatia at the end of the presentation. Tatia Bauer is the regional steward for the MDI, for the Maine Coast Heritage Trust for the past 2 years, and she's completed an undergraduate degree in ecology and evolutionary biology and a master's thesis studying pollinator restoration ecology with various outdoor careers in between. So everybody please welcome Tatia.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's awesome to see everybody here. Thank you for making it out in the misty evening, and for those folks online. Yeah, let's get right into it. So yeah, I'll be talking about some of the marsh restoration work that MCHT has been getting into in the past couple years, and some exciting projects that are happening on MDI. So quickly run through an agenda, shameless plug, MCHT. Then I'll be talking about our Marshes for Tomorrow initiative, which is kind of guiding this work. Talk about salt marshes and their issues. It's a little technical, but I'll try to keep it, relatively easy. Then we'll need to take a historical detour into colonial salt hay agriculture, which is really the driving force behind the degradation of salt marshes. And then those mechanisms of salt marsh subsidence. So salt marsh subsidence is just decreasing elevation, which is one of the issues that marshes are facing. Then I'll talk about how to restore salt marsh function, how to do a salt marsh restoration project, including the ones on MDI, and then I'll have time for questions. If there's a really important clarifying question that you have, feel free to raise your hand and we can pause to do that. But before I get into it, I wanted to acknowledge our kind of expert partners. So MCHT did not develop these restoration techniques. We are really relying on a partnership with a large coalition on the East Coast. So they're the Salt Marsh Adaptation and Resiliency Team, or SMART teams. And they're researchers, federal, state agency folks, restoration practitioners, landowners, and they saw what was happening in salt marshes over time and developed these restoration techniques to mitigate the impacts of salt hay agricultural features. And so they're really on the forefront of these techniques. So they've been really getting us up to speed, and we're kind of running with it as an organization. Okay, so now the shameless plug. So MCHT was started in 1970, really to facilitate the easements of Acadia National Park as buffer habitat. And then we grew to now have 4 offices, 60 staff, and we own land and manage and do a bunch of conservation work up and down the state, specifically in the coastal zone. And we are kind of the local land trust to MDI, which is awesome. And we focus on conserving land for access to the coast, supporting communities. A lot of that is through agricultural work. We also house the Maine Land Trust Network, which is kind of the grouping of all the land trusts in Maine, and there are over 80, which is wild. Oops. When we think about conservation, we talk about landscape connectivity. We have a rivers initiative, which is focusing on river restoration and river connectivity and habitat. And then I'll be focusing on our Marshes for Tomorrow work, which is really focused on protecting marsh habitat and the upland marsh migration space up and down the coast. And so within that Marshes for Tomorrow initiative, we really have what we call like the 3-legged stool for coastal resiliency. The first leg is land protection. So that's protecting the marsh and the migration space. That's restoration. And then that's being involved with tidal restoration projects. So all those road crossings on marshes are impacting the way that they function. And so we're kind of getting involved with tidal restoration work. That's mostly a supportive role. Other organizations and DOT are taking that on, but it's definitely part of the stool. And so on the land protection side, we're conserving marshes and their upland buffers for all the ecological values and all the reasons that we love salt marshes, right? Awesome wildlife habitat, places for birds to nest. We talked about marsh-specific birds, including the state endangered salt marsh sparrow, but there's also nesting sparrows, and they nest on the marsh platform. So they're really vulnerable to sea level rise and changes in elevation of the marsh. Salt marshes are nurseries for marine species. They provide flood and storm surge protection. They reduce upland erosion and kind of buffer the wave action. They can filter nutrients, pollutants. And then this is also a really important part of salt marshes, the carbon storage. So the underground biomass, our underground carbon storage of salt marshes is up to 10 times as much as the similar acreage of Maine forests. So that's a really important thing that we want to not cause that to, we don't want that carbon to go into the atmosphere, right? We want that to be a carbon sink. They're beautiful. We talk about driving past marshes, you know, they're great. They're awesome places for recreation, education, and cultural importance. And I just want to highlight that I won't be going into the cultural importance through this work, but that's an ongoing discussion when we talk about marsh conservation and marsh stewardship. Okay, so that was land protection, right? The first leg. The second leg is restoration, and that was kind of a evolvement from our initial land protection work in the coastal space. Because as we started to interact with salt marshes, and getting partnered with the Smart Teams group, we recognize how modified and impaired those systems are, and that the degraded functions from the impairments that I'll go into many details about reduce the resiliency of salt marshes to sea level rise. And so really immediate interventions are needed. And the techniques that we are employing, not just MCHT, many organizations up and down the East Coast, are really the best techniques that we have possible to save the current extent of marshes. And like I said, these restoration techniques support salt marsh sparrow, which are those endemic salt marsh birds. So kind of like some basic stuff about marshes. They're intertidal systems, so they exist between low and high tide. And every tidal cycle, and we get 2 of those a day, right? The tidal flow brings water, sediment, salt. It submerges at least part of the salt marsh. And every time that tide comes in, the root matter of the plants on the marsh capture that sediment and can kind of build over time. Those roots kind of decompose and starts to store that carbon. And the different plant species on the marsh are adapted to different inundation frequencies, right? Some like to be flooded every day, the lower marsh species. Some prefer flooding every month, you know, twice a month at king and spring tides. But they always need some air exposure, right? None of these plants survive fully inundated, and that you'll see why that's important. So ultimately though, kind of at a basic level, functioning marshes need sediment supply, and they need proper hydrology to support the different vegetation that are adapted to these flooding frequencies. And healthy and functioning marshes can build elevation to match sea level rise. They're adapted to do that. That's how they were developed kind of in the first place. So that's a really important thing that we want to make sure that they're functioning and they can accrete in step with sea level rise. Okay, that was a lot. Does anybody have any kind of questions about the basics of salt marshes? Yeah.
Excuse me. Would you mind?
When you were explaining about the sediment, is that what makes it so that it can buffer the sea level rise because it's building soils with the intertidal exchanges? Is that what you're saying, that how do you build that soil up so that it's at a higher level?
Yeah, as the salt marsh floods more, all the dense plant matter can capture that sediment and also deposit some of its own root matter over time. And so if there's more sediment supply via like just more flooding frequency, it can capture that and accrete in step. Yeah. So it is, yeah, just capturing the sediment, that mixture of sediment that's suspended in the water and the roots themselves building. So you need healthy plants. That's the biggest part. Great question. Thank you. Okay, so let's talk about Salte agriculture. So this is that historical detour. So this is a colonial practice from like the 1600s to the 1900s. And basically it was wild hydrologic modifications of the salt marsh. So you can see these folks working on a salt marsh and altering them. Essentially, they wanted to reclaim salt marshes and make them into productive agricultural fields. So they would block out salt water through building high elevation berms that we call embankments, and also through the use of ditching infrastructure, which would drain each side of the ditch. And the ability, and that would kind of freshen the system over time and really increase the production of the hay by like 200 to 300%. That would be used for livestock generally. And so these ditching networks would extend all the way back up onto the marsh, sometimes up into the forest. So really, really altered landscape. This was pervasive along the East Coast. 90% of marshes have some indication of these embankments and ditches. And also this happened over many generations. And so each kind of generation changed things a little bit. So we have that layered infrastructure. And when I say infrastructure, I'm talking about the kind of network of ditching and embankments on the marshes. And so that infrastructure is layered, but now it's unmaintained, right? This is kind of forlorn practice, but these structures are still present on the marsh and are altering the way hydrology, water flows on the marsh. Remember, that's a key part of a functioning marsh, is just proper hydrology. And it's leading in a variety of ways to marsh subsidence, so a decrease in elevation of the marsh. So here's kind of what that embankment looks like on a cross section. So we have, some of them would have these flapper gates where during a high tide it would close and the salt water couldn't reach the upper parts of the marsh. And in the low tide, the water would drain out. And this is kind of what it looks like from an aerial photo. This is an extreme example, but you can see all these really unnatural straight lines. So not only would there be embankments all along the edge of creeks, but then when they were digging these drainage ditches, they'd dig the ditch and then pile all of that spoil up on one side. So spatially, a ditch and embankment are usually linked together. So that's just one thing. Usually where you find a ditch, you'll find an embankment right next to it. So these are some cool historical photos. They put the hay on these saddles to prevent them from getting rotten during high tide, so it'd keep it just out of the flood zone. And very profitable, made certain people very happy. And this is kind of what it looks like now. Here on the left, you can see the embankment going left to right with a plank drain or underneath that would drain the water from up on the marsh farther behind. This is not any of the infrastructure that I just mentioned, but this is kind of an old degraded boat wharf, so that they would mow the hay and then ship it off on a boat. And so you can see, they worked really hard to make sure that they could get that hay and ship it off to where they needed it. Here's another example. This is a embankment, and either side are those ditches, right? They dug these ditches to build up this high elevation piece. And it's super variable depending on the site. You can have these massive, 6-foot deep ditching. This is in the Narragansett River area. But you can also have these really marginal ditches. So this is a spot on MDI Mitchell Marsh, which I will talk about in a sec. And this is actually Mitchell Marsh. So if you think about Bass Harbor Marsh, it's just around the corner. And sorry, I should have put the overarching map first, but I'll show you kind of its location in a sec. But you can see all of these lines are different embankments. And so it just covers the entire marsh. Some of these have just degraded over time, so they're not super obvious, right? They're not those big embankments that I just showed you, but they're still altering the hydrology of the system. Okay, so then we had that historical detour, but like how are those agricultural infrastructures leading to degradation of the marsh over time? And there's two real main mechanisms. First is oxidative subsidence caused by the ditching. And the second is waterlogged subsidence caused by the expansion of large mega pools or areas of standing water. And I'm going to go into all of these in detail. Okay, so the oxidative subsidence, we have an open ditch. So typically in a salt marsh, the groundwater is just 20 centimeters below the surface of the marsh. And then that 20 centimeters is just changing depending on the tide, whether it's full of water or if it has some air in it, right? When you have a ditch, now that groundwater, kind of like a well, it meets the bottom of the ditch and it brings the groundwater level down for a certain kind of angle off the bottom. And so that leads to all of this area now having air or oxidation, which can lead to decomposition. And this area kind of slumps over time, right? There's all these like bacteria that now, like air, they have all this organic material in the sediment. They can go munch on that. And eventually that kind of reduces the volume in there and it lowers over time. So that's what's the problem with the ditching. That's what the ditches are causing over time. On the other end, the waterlogged subsidence trajectory, this is formed when obstructions form in ditches, right? And the water behind can't properly drain every tidal cycle. So we have something blocking the water leaving the marsh, the water gets held back on the marsh over time, the areas become inundated, and all those plants need some period of air exposure. And so if they're fully flooded all the time, there's vegetation, all those plants die. And then all of that area where they had their living roots collapses, right? All that space that was taken up collapses. And now there's more space for the water to collect. And we have now just lost a bunch of elevation of the marsh. And so in that way, and because it changes the conditions locally of the marsh, there's standing water now, they tend to expand over time. And so this is again Mitchell Marsh, and you can see all of these areas are standing water. Here's a massive area of standing water, and they just kind of expand over time. You have these high areas of actually embankments that are still vegetated, but that's because they're high enough that they haven't been flooded consistently. And so these just expand over time. And so if there's no vegetation, there's no plant cover, there's none of those stems and roots that are going to capture the sediment. And so now there's no accretion. Those marshes can't build over time to keep in step with sea level rise. And so now that reduces their resiliency. Hopefully that makes sense. So this is kind of one expression of mega pools, right? We have some little hummocky parts. We have standing water back there, but it's kind of interspersed. And those can expand to massive, you know, quarter-acre pools over time. And that's what we really want to target with our restoration. Okay, so we have these factors and mechanisms that are causing the marsh in areas to subside over time. And this is a simplified graph, bear with me. We have sea level rise coming up, right? Eventually, they're going to intersect at some point, right? Where sea levels could be so high that the marsh plants just can't really thrive anymore. And that's what we want to intervene before that point and create a revised marsh trajectory via restoration. Again, very idealized, but that's kind of the gist. And so how do we do that, right? This is back to Mitchell Marsh, where we have all of these ditching and embankments that are parallel, that are fracturing the marsh. We want to eliminate that fracturing and create a more natural, idealized hydrology that we call single channel hydrology. And that mimics our understanding of what the marsh was doing before saute agriculture, before all these modifications were done to the landscape. So it's a more dendritic, evenly spaced hydrological network that is able to drain every part of the marsh, but not overly drain it like those high density ditches were doing. And when we're thinking of this hydrological pattern, you want it to be sized to the kind of tidal range of the site. So something up in Maine with our big tides might look a little different than something down in the Chesapeake. Cool. So this is what we want the hydrology to look like, but we have all of these things getting in our way. So how do we take this and make it look more like that functionally? So we do that through two mechanisms to treat both of those subsidence trajectories, right? Ditch remediation is trying to halt that oxidative subsidence from the over ditching. And so we do that by reducing the ditch depth and density over time. And then we do channel remediation, which serves to drain those pools that have standing water, reintroduce tidal flow to those areas, and allow the marsh vegetation to function and do what they need to do. So ditch remediation is a pretty simple process. Essentially what we do is in areas of ditching that we want to remediate, we mow a certain area of the marsh just with a push behind mower, and it doesn't take too much space. You kind of roll that hay into a little roll and you secure it into the bottom of the ditch. So now you have this nice woven substrate where it can capture sediment now, and it kind of builds peat from the bottom up. And you repeat that several years, and it creates this really stable base that allows the groundwater to rise back up, right? And so now we're not having this oxidative subsidence, this sinking of the marsh around the ditches. We typically do that in the fall when the plants are the biggest and the breeding birds have left or are done breeding. And you repeat that for 2 to 4 years, depending on how deep your ditch is. So this is a picture of just that. So this area has been mowed. They've scraped all of that mowed hay into the area, and now this person is kind of securing it into the bottom. And this is from some literature published on these processes of, right, we have this large open ditch bottom that doesn't really change over time. But with these treatments, you can see that it starts to fill in and then it actually starts to revegetate. So we've kind of halted and reversed the effects of those ditches through this treatment. Here's some more pictures. This was at one of our sites in Hancock, Maine, where we're a little farther along in the process. So you can see this is a nice little Italian small push behind mower. Then we have a hay rake that rolls it, securing it with some stakes and some twine. And so you pound that deep into the ground just to make sure that it doesn't float away right away. So here's some more pictures of that. And this is what it looks like. You'd pound these stakes in a little bit farther, but you can kind of, yeah, this is just what it looks like. And so this is starting to fill in that ditch. Okay, I know I've been a lot, that's a lot. All of this has been a lot. Are there any questions about this specific treatment or ditching? Okay, awesome. Then I will go into the next part of restoration.
Actually,
Yeah.
with the change in the damage that's been done in the salt marshes, have, you know, species of plants moved in that are not conducive? Do you have to deal with plants that aren't appropriate for the salt marsh?
Yeah, in some sites there have been invasions of Phragmites, which is an invasive freshwater species, but they can kind of survive oftentimes behind embankments where some fresh water is being held as it runs off the woods. And so actually one of the treatments to get rid of that is to reintroduce salt water, which drives that out. So this process actually supports the removal of that invasive species. But you know, there's not as many species on the other end of the spectrum that are a little bit more suited for these extreme conditions or saltier, lower, more flooded spaces. So not too much in that other direction. That's a really good question. The invasive species is definitely always top of mind when you think about these projects. So you don't want to facilitate more of that. Okay, so the next part, so that was ditch remediation, channel remediation, which is addressing those oversaturated pooled areas, is to essentially dig what we call runnels, which are very shallow. They're about 8 inches deep, 30 inches wide, right? This is not going below where we want the groundwater to be. That's a really important part. But it now provides this way for this pooled area of the marsh to properly drain. And so we do this from November to April. And so, yeah, that depth does not cause the oxidation. We are connecting the pools to the main channel. And a big thing is that we're not trying to fracture the marsh more. So we try to use the existing infrastructure. We use the footprint of old ditching that has kind of healed itself whenever possible. And then so through digging these shallow runnels, now we have all this sediment, and we use that to build what we call microtopography mounds or nesting mounds. So we'll strategically place them in a specific area to build not super high, 8-inch high mounds of vegetation now that are these little refuges for salt marsh sparrow and Nelson sparrow, those endemic salt marsh birds that like to nest directly on the marsh habitat and the marsh platform. So it's kind of a mutual, it's a double whammy. I don't know. It serves 2 purposes, which is great for the marsh and its inhabitants. And so this is one example of just a little bit of drainage happened at this site on its own. And this is the start of the vegetation creeping in. So this used to be fully underwater for a couple inches. Some drainage happened, and now the plants are already creeping in.
After how long?
That's just the next year. And then this one was a more intentional drainage. So we actually dug a runnel on this pool. Renee was there. And this is again that next summer, And all of this vegetation is completely new. So that's just slowly creeping in from the edges of the pools. And then as those roots spread, right, it builds up, it beefs up that volume, increases the elevation, and creates even better habitat for plants to grow. And so at this point, our goal is to essentially alter the hydrology and allow the plants to come in naturally. If things don't happen at a rate that we want to see it, then we would, is that the owl? Sorry. Oh, it's 6 o'clock. Okay, gotcha. I saw this like light go off and I put them together. Yeah. So if these plants don't kind of close in on the pool at a rate that we want to, we would then do some adaptive management and do some planting by either seed, or you can actually trim the top of some of these plants once the seeds are mature and kind of throw them forcefully into the muck, and they will submerge enough to grow. And so those are some things that we will explore as we get further along. And so, yeah, those two treatments are really what marsh restoration is. We are just targeting areas where we want to remediate those ditching, or where we want to drain pools. And so projects like the two that we're doing on MDI, there's kind of a couple phases to the process. First is the design phase. We go to our expert partners in that SMART team who have been doing this for years and years. They come help us assess the site, figure out what areas of the marsh can be altered, where we need to change the hydrology. We map all the legacy features, so we need to understand where those embankments, where those ditches are right now before we can move forward. We take some baseline measurements. We create the restoration design plan. So we create that single channel hydrology, utilizing the infrastructure that we identified at that site. And that's through a combination of using aerial imagery and also field visits. So oftentimes we go out with a little soil probe and you can feel the different densities on the marsh, and that's telling you where an embankment is. All right, so it's like really dense here, you can feel it, it's stable, that's probably an embankment. If the soil probe just kind of falls in, or you fall in, I can't tell you how many times it's like, oh, there's plants there, and then that's actually a really unstable ditch that kind of has some plants on top of it. And so that's how you map those over time. And some people are, Jeff Wilson, who's our restoration practitioner and contractor, we call him like the marsh whisperer. He's so good, and we're all getting up to speed here at MCHT. So you map the impairments. You've seen this image. This is Mitchell Marsh. And so that's kind of the first step. Then you figure out what the single channel hydrology is, right? Evenly spaced, more dendritic. And then you identify where areas where you need to do channel remediation. So that's all this yellow, right? The hydrology in this area isn't actually doing what it needs to do. So we need to introduce some runnels here. And then the green in between is areas where we need to kind of fracture the hydrology so that we can kind of split that, make it look more like this. You can see here, right? This is kind of a tide shed. This is going to be one area. This will be a different tide shed, and we want to split those in two. And so that's where we're going to fill in the ditch. And now we have runnels on either side. So that's kind of year one, or year zero, sorry, pre-project. The first year, again, over the fall, winter, we do the implementation, which is the channel remediation and the ditch remediation. after we've gotten all the appropriate permits and stuff, of course. And then after that, we are really just in the monitoring phase. Besides those repeated times where we do the ditch remediation, we just want to make sure that our interventions are doing what we want them to do. And so, and if they're not, then we go back to the plan, see where something needs to be changed and how we can improve the hydrology of the system. And so now here's the overview map that I probably should have started with before. But these are the two projects where we are in that sweet spot between year 0 and year 1. So we have found funding to implement these projects. We have design plans for them, and hopefully the implementation, the start of the work will happen this fall. Depending, you know, timing is everything. So that's our goal, but it's possible that some of these things can be pushed back. You have to really work with the tides and the weather and people's schedules. So yeah, but Babson Creek is behind our office. So we actually have a trail that you can park by our office and go down. Most of our marsh space is across the creek, but you can see some things from the trail. And then Mitchell Marsh is, yeah, right here in Tremont. And it's a water access only preserve, but it's really beautiful if you feel like going for a paddle to walk around. And they both show signs of that salte agricultural impairments. And these projects are special too, because most of the marsh, MCHT has conserved and owns almost the entire marsh system. So we have kind of the ability to do these projects. In other areas, right, the intertidal space is owned by the upland owners in Maine. And so in other areas of the marsh, like that project in Hancock that we mentioned, there's kind of a matrix of landowners. And so we're only working on our space, but ideally you're kind of working in the whole system. And so that's something that we come up against sometimes with this work. And this was funded by the Maine Natural Resource Conservation Program. So when there's negative impacts to wetlands, basically some money is paid into this program, which is then dispersed to conservation groups to do wetland restoration, enhancement, creation projects. So love that group. Yeah.
Is the rebuilding of the bridge by Babson Creek going to affect are they going to widen the channel going in and out?
That's a really good question. That's a great question, great topic. So my understanding is that the bridge, they're not going to change the flow rate underneath it. So they're going to change the infrastructure, but it's not going to change the level of restriction. But it's a really important thing in other parts of the state where the road is causing an immense restriction. And if there are plans to widen a culvert or anything, you want to make sure to do the restoration of the marsh behind that road crossing ahead of time, so that you have functioning hydrology before you introduce now a bunch more water more regularly through the culvert resizing. And so that's where this like statewide partnership coordination is really important, and timing things to the best of our ability. Yeah, but that's a really good question. Did that answer your? So yeah, now I'll talk, I just want to end really on some of the challenges to this work. So remember that really idealized, simplified graph, right? There's going to be that intersection point, and so we want to work ahead of that. And so it's kind of urgent, and we have limited time to make progress, you know, in the decade range. That's our kind of timeline. But to design and implement these projects, you need a highly specialized set of skills. And so that's kind of limiting our ability to expand the pace and scale of this work. We're working on ways to go around that and to build capacity, but that is currently kind of a bottleneck of the process. Timing is a little tricky, so because of natural cycles, we want to work in the winter, right? It's good, we want to protect fish and nesting birds. But then you also want to work during the day, right, in daylight, and during neap tides, and when the low tide is during the middle of the day. And so when you kind of break that down, that's like 5 days in a month. And so, it's very limited. Maybe every 2 weeks, it's probably 5 days. But yeah, so that's what we've come up against a lot, is just storms can really throw off a schedule and you have to wait till the next tidal cycle. Permitting, we have to work with the US Army Corps of Engineers and the State Department of Environmental Protection. Also funding can require its own permitting and monitoring standards. And right now, every organization up and down the coast who are taking on these projects are managing them by themselves. And so it's kind of, it's a little less efficient. And so we're trying to do more coordination, so it feels like this really unified front when we talk about this work. And then, yeah, honestly, this is exciting, kind of complex stuff, and it requires logistics for monitoring. It requires, there's a variety of land ownerships, and we need folks to be bought into the process. But I think the potential here to increase the resiliency of these marshes that are so important for, one of those first slides of all the ecological values of the marshes is really why we do this work. And so all of these challenges are absolutely worth it. And we're trying at MCHT and with our partner organizations to overcome these, to really spread the impact of this work to more and more marshes.
Tatia?
Yeah.
A question from online, question Craig K. Is Acadia National Park on board with this same work? For example, Bass Harbor Marsh.
Yes, yeah, I actually just connected with one of the SMART teams, and they will be, I know that he's in conversations with the park to at least do an assessment to understand the infrastructure. Acadia is really far along with Wabanaki Coast stewardship, so how that fits into their decision making, I can't speak to, but it never hurts to have an assessment of that, the agricultural features, and so I think they're working towards that. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. So I'm curious how the appropriate hydrology gets decided. You said it was a set of highly specialized skills, but is there software or alchemy or magic? How does someone look at a marsh and say, okay, based on what I'm seeing, I think the water should be going here?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's, to my understanding, it is a little bit of alchemy. I know he being this Jeff Wilson, who to date has been creating our restoration design plans. I know a little bit of his process, which is essentially to look at marsh areas, marshes within the area of your project site, and you can look at historical photos, and you can see the expression of channels over time. And if a channel is really stable and isn't changing, you can kind of compare, you can extend that into the whole marsh system. Like, okay, this channel is reaching so many acres of marsh. Let's kind of replicate that as compared to, this channel, it keeps moving. Like the water isn't effectively stabilizing in this configuration. So we're gonna not do that. And so you wanna take those stabilized channels and try to replicate that within the infrastructure that exists. And I also think there is an element of, there's so much pooling, we just need to have channels there that are draining those pools. But also magic, to my knowledge. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm interested in the plant species that flourish in the marsh, and I just wondered if you try to replicate what's been there historically when you're restoring, or are you inventorying what plants have been lost through the inundation in the pools? Or, you know, and if you have native plant nurseries that can supply these species.
Yeah, that's a really good question. There is a local native plant nursery in Maine, and the name is evading me. But they were saying that these salt species are a little hard to propagate because you need that proper flooding and salinity. I have some extra slides for questions. So plants specifically, the diversity on the marsh is not extremely high. So we have these kind of different zones, which are a little complicated by all the infrastructure. We have low marsh, we have this high marsh, and then we have this upland. And this marsh upland boundary is often the most diverse, where it's kind of some salt tolerant freshwater plants that can survive mixed in with salt tolerant plants. And then as you go lower down into the marsh, the diversity goes down. So low marsh is really dominated by Spartina alterniflora is a scientific name, salt hay. And so these are really adapted to that low marsh where it's flooded almost daily. And then when you get into the high marsh area, that's where it's Spartina patens, that really verdant color that you'll see on the marsh. And a lot of the marshes in Maine are this high platform marsh. And so you'll see that, and it's kind of this, some of this wispy stuff. And then also this is the other kind of variety, the stickless. And so these species, all these different communities at the different marsh elevations and flooding frequencies are known. My knowledge of any long-term tracking of like what was there and what's disappeared, I'm not sure if anybody kept those really good records over time. Because these pools have been, you know, they have been present on the landscape for a while, that, you know, for a long time, they were understood to just be natural occurrences on the marsh until subsidence kind of took enough subsidence happened that these features became way more obvious. And so then they started to explore why these pools are kind of detrimental and caused by the agricultural practices.
Did the recent storms, did they have any immediate impact on either of these projects?
No, not to my knowledge. And I went and checked where we have done restoration on the marsh a little bit. We've done at least the ditch remediation, and those all fared well. All the securing pieces stayed. And so that's really great. But you always have the risk with those big storms, big tidal events, especially along the edges of these channels. And you can see there's already kind of some scouring and some slumping for erosion to happen on the edges of channels. So that's something that could be more frequent, where we just lose marsh from erosion in that way. But luckily, I think these are contained and removed enough from the waves and things that they were fine. It's a good question.
All right, so thank you. Oh, we got some more questions. Great.
Thank you. So you have an army of volunteers or fully paid staff, and is all of that funded by the conservation group that you mentioned?
Yeah, yes, and all of the above and beyond. So we've done a lot with the MNRCP for funding, but we also have private funders who are supporting this work that have indicated they want to support project specifics. We've also applied for various grant and private funding to expand our marsh department. So we have a couple of those in the works right now to hire more staff. So right now, this has been I've been kind of our local marsh person. But I also have another whole set of views of stewarding our preserved properties in Blue Hill Peninsula and Merchant Row. So, you know, for as much as we want to dedicate time and effort to the marshes, we need somebody who can dedicate all of their time. So we're working towards that. And to date, all of our work has been done in-house and through contractors. So that ditch remediation only takes a few people. It's not too bad. Runnels, we actually take very small excavating equipment on big wide mats so that their weight's distributed to dig out those small channels. But we're exploring ways where we can use manpower, right? So if I go back to that like initial slide of the settlers digging, you know, how can we use that for good to remediate that? And if we just have trained people or normally, you know, everyday people with kind of trained restoration practitioners to allow people to hand dig those runnels. I think that's going to be the kind of future of this work, just to make sure that we have the impact that we want. But we're not there yet. But if you would like to be on a list to get out on a marsh and do some runnel digging, I'm sure we can flip one of these papers over and everyone can write their name and email, and I'd be happy to email and call you up for those days in the fall and winter. So
And do you have any other sort of significant projects you work on as a steward?
oh yeah. Yeah, a lot, a ton of them. It's all variable, you know. A lot of it, since we have so much public access with our preserves, a lot of it is trail maintenance. So, you know, after January, there was a lot of days just out with a chainsaw trying to clear blowdowns and things like that. Structures, island cleanups. We try to partner with folks to do cleanups along our islands for, you know, all the shore trash and things like that. But honestly, it's a different job every day, so which is awesome.
Great, well, great, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Did we talk about Carl Little
Yeah.
already?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
I applied for the musical leadership. I was excited, I was so cool, but I wasn't there.
Yeah, well, you know, the monitoring is, so if you're interested in like the American side of it too, definitely come with your neighbor. That's the next you. Yeah, yeah, let me grab my backpack.
Hi. I am. Converting to us last year.